In the blazing summer heat of 1716, 14 of South Carolina's richest plantation owners came together for what they believed would be an ordinary business meeting at the Grayfield estate. Not a single one of them ever walked out alive. When officials finally arrived 3 days later, what they uncovered made no sense to anyone. Burned bodies were placed in a flawless circle around a huge coal furnace. Their hands were locked with iron chains, and their mouths were packed with unprocessed cotton. The only living person found was an enslaved woman named Esperanza de Lima. She sat quietly in the estate kitchen, gently humming a Portuguese lullaby, while slowly sharpening kitchen knives. When authorities tried to question her, she repeated only one sentence in broken English. "Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete." By direct order of Governor Robert Johnson, all colonial records of the event were sealed and hidden away in Charleston's archives for more than 200 years. Tonight, we uncover the horrifying truth behind what later became known as the Grayfield Massacre. It is a story of revenge so precise and savage that it forever changed how the colony viewed the people it enslaved. Before we go deeper into the story of Esperanza de Lima and the night that shook colonial South Carolina to its core, I need you to do something for me. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this, buried by time and silenced by powerful men, deserve to be heard. And while you're here, tell me in the comments which state you're listening from. Do you think dark historical secrets are hiding near your own home? Now, let's travel back to 1716 and uncover how a woman considered nothing more than property carried out one of the most carefully planned acts of revenge in colonial American history. This story does not begin on that terrible night, but 15 years earlier in the busy port city of Charleston, South Carolina. It was 1701, and the colony was enjoying massive wealth built entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans working rice plantations along the coastal lowlands. One of the most powerful planters was Edmund Grayfield, a second-generation colonist whose family had carved out a 3,000-acre empire from the swamps north of the Ashley River. Grayfield was especially cruel, even by the brutal standards of the time. He stood over 6 feet tall, with pale blue eyes that seemed to stare through people instead of at them. He was known for breaking slaves both in body and in spirit. His plantation, Grayfield Estate, was whispered about in slave quarters across the region. People said that anyone sent there either died within a year or survived as an empty shadow of who they once were. In September of 1701, a Portuguese slave ship named the Santa Maria arrived in Charleston harbor, carrying 180 captives from the Angolan coast. Among them was a young woman, likely around 20 years old, who would later be given the name Esperanza de Lima by her owner. At first glance, nothing about her seemed unusual to the white colonists who examined her like an animal at the market. She was of average height and build, with sharp dark eyes and detailed tribal markings on her shoulders that told the story of noble blood. That story would remain completely unknown to those who claimed to own her. What they could not know was that Esperanza was the daughter of a powerful village chief, trained since childhood in strategy, negotiation, and what colonists would have called witchcraft, but was in truth a deep knowledge of herbs, poisons, and the human mind. She had watched Portuguese raiders burn her village, kill her father, and enslave her people. From that moment on, every white face she saw was tied to that original crime. Edmund Grayfield bought her for £42 sterling, a high price that reflected her youth and strong health. He already had plans for her. His former house slave, an elderly woman named Sarah, had recently died under suspicious circumstances. Everyone on the plantation knew she had been beaten to death for spilling wine on his expensive English carpet. From her very first day at Grayfield Estate, Esperanza began what would become a 15-year campaign of silent observation and careful planning. She learned English quickly, but pretended to understand very little. She watched everything. She listened closely. She remembered every insult, every punishment, and every name spoken quietly among the colony's elite. Grayfield Estate was not just a home. It served as the unofficial gathering place for the Rice Council, a group of 14 plantation owners who controlled agricultural rules and, in many ways, the political future of the colony. These men met each month to discuss rice prices, slave laws, and ways to increase profits while avoiding oversight from London. They believed themselves to be kings of their own lands, accountable to no one. The council included the most powerful families in the colony. Edmund Greyfield acted as the unofficial leader. William Peton owned the most productive rice plantation in the Americas. James Rutherford also worked as a colonial judge. Marcus Sutton ran the largest slave trading operation between Charleston and Savannah. Henry Caldwell's political influence reached directly into the governor's office. Thomas Harrington, a former British naval officer, ruled his plantation like a military base. Benjamin Fairfax came from one of the oldest colonial families. Samuel Kingsley specialized in breaking newly arrived African slaves. Robert Fielding was infamous for inventing new forms of torture. Charles Warwick owned land bordering 3 other plantations and controlled valuable information routes. Jonathan Crichton kept detailed records of slave breeding program. David Norris used his medical knowledge to keep slaves alive just long enough to drain every ounce of labor from them. Alexander Hartwell operated a plantation that functioned as a prison for captured runaways. The youngest member was George Baxter, only 35, whose love of violence earned him quick acceptance into the group. These men were not simply cruel, they were methodically evil. They treated human beings as tools to be used, fixed, or thrown away whenever profits demanded it. During their meetings, they shared methods for crushing rebellion, discussed how little food a slave could survive on while still working, and bragged about their harshest punishments. Esperanza served them for 15 years, moving quietly through the dining room like a ghost, pouring drinks and clearing plates while they spoke of enslaved people as if they were livestock. She heard them laugh about families they had torn apart, argue over branding versus whipping, and plan expansions that would require hundreds more captives. But what truly pushed Esperanza toward action was not just the everyday cruelty of slavery. It was something deeply personal. In the spring of 1715, her life changed forever. After 14 years of silent suffering, she achieved what plantation owners believed impossible. She kept her humanity alive. More than that, she fell in love. His real name was Wami, though plantation records listed him only as Boy Tom. He had been born on the Rutherford plantation in 1693, making him 22 when Esperanza noticed him. Wami had an unusual mix of strength and intelligence that somehow survived the brutal seasoning process. He could read, a skill learned secretly from a kind overseer who later died. On Sundays, during short rest periods, he quietly taught other slaves letters and numbers. Wami and Esperanza met in secret, at first sharing information about their owners' movements and plans. Their bond grew slowly and carefully, knowing discovery would mean death. They communicated using songs and gestures that looked harmless to white observers, but carried detailed messages about patrols, safe paths, and resistance. By the end of 1715, they had built what may have been the most advanced intelligence network in colonial South Carolina. Esperanza gathered information during Rice Council meetings about patrol schedules, legal shifts, and weak points in plantation security. Wami, often sent to other plantations for heavy labor, built contacts across the region. Together, they planned something unheard of, not a simple escape, but a coordinated uprising that could free hundreds. They identified sympathetic whites, marked safe houses, and even contacted free black communities in Spanish Florida willing to shelter escapees. Their careful plans unraveled because of human emotion and greed. On March 15, 1716, Edmund Greyfield announced at the monthly council meeting that he was expanding his breeding program. He had selected several female slaves he considered prime specimens to be paired with males from other plantations to produce what he called superior working stock. The program would begin immediately, with the women moved to a guarded compound to ensure pregnancy. Esperanza's name was placed at the very top of the list. When she overheard this talk while pouring wine for the council members, her face stayed calm and unreadable, but something deep inside her changed forever. She had survived 15 years of slavery by holding on to hope. Hope for freedom, hope for revenge, hope for a future where she could live as a human being instead of as property. Now Greyfield was planning to reduce her to nothing more than an animal meant for breeding. That single truth crushed something inside her and hardened something else at the same time. That night, She met Kame at their usual place, a fallen cypress tree hidden deep in the rice fields of the plantation, where the noise of insects and night birds swallowed their voices. She told him about Greyfield's plan, and they both understood immediately what it meant. Once she was moved to the breeding compound, any contact between them would end. Their small intelligence network would fall apart. Their carefully planned uprising would die before it ever began. Kame was desperate. He said they should run away that very night. He had already made contact with a Spanish trader who could smuggle them to St. Augustine within a week. They could be free, start a new life, and maybe even find a way to help other slaves from a safer distance. But Esperanza refused. Running would save them, she told him in Portuguese, the language they used only for their most private moments. But it would change nothing for their people. These men would keep doing evil things. More ships would come. More families would be torn apart. More children would grow up owned by others. She reminded him that she had spent 15 years watching these 14 men make choices that affected thousands of lives with careless cruelty. She had heard them joke about separating families, talk about torture like it was a recipe, and plan expansions that would bring even more pain to people who looked like her. She told him she had learned their habits. She knew their secrets. She knew when they were weakest. They had one chance to send a message that would never be forgotten, one chance to make these men feel fear the way they made others feel fear every day. Kame understood what she was suggesting, and it terrified him. Not death itself, because slaves lived with death always close, but the slow and organized torture that would come before execution if they were caught. He had seen what happened to slaves who raised their hands against white men. The punish me. NTS were designed to break everyone who watched. Still, he knew Esperanza was right. Escaping would save 2 lives and leave the system untouched. Her plan was almost unthinkable in its danger, but it offered something larger, a strike against slavery itself, something that might inspire others or at least make slave owners hesitate before acting with such casual cruelty. They spent the next 2 weeks shaping a plan that mixed intelligence work, psychological pressure, and a precise attack. Esperanza would use her access to the monthly Rice Council meeting to open the door for devastating revenge. Kame would manage logistics, gathering materials, setting up alibis for slaves who could be trusted, and preparing backup plans for different outcomes. What they created was one of the most complex acts of resistance ever attempted by slaves in colonial America, and it depended on one simple truth Esperanza had noticed over 15 years. The Rice Council members believed so strongly in their power that they had grown careless about their own safety. The meeting set for June 23, 1716, would be their last. June 23, 1716. Arrived with a heavy heat that made South Carolina summers nearly unbearable for everyone except those who had grown up near the equator in Africa. Esperanza woke before sunrise, as she had every day for 15 years, and began her routine. But this day was different. This day marked the end of 15 years of watching, planning, and swallowed anger. The Rice Council meeting was scheduled to begin at 2 in the afternoon, giving the 14 plantation owners time to arrive at Greyfield Estate and handle private business beforehand. These meetings usually lasted 4 to 6 hours, depending on the agenda and how much imported rum Edmund Greyfield served. Esperanza had spent weeks studying earlier meetings, noting seating choices, bathroom breaks, and the timing of each topic. She knew Marcus Sutton always arrived early to conduct private deals with Greyfield. She knew Benjamin Fairfax had a weak bladder and excused himself about every 90 minutes. She knew rice prices were discussed before dinner, while talk of slave control came later, after the rum had loosened their mouths. Most important of all, she knew about the coal furnace. Greyfield Estate, built in 1695, had a massive kitchen meant to feed the main house, overseers, craftsmen, and domestic slaves. At its center stood a huge coal-burning furnace imported from Britain at great cost. Unlike common wood fireplaces, this furnace could hold extreme heat for long periods, perfect for large-scale cooking. It stood nearly 8 feet tall and 4 feet square, made of fire brick and surrounded by iron fixtures for pots, spits, and airflow control. When fully fed with coal, it could reach temperatures above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt copper and silver. Greyfield took great pride in it and often showed it off to visitors. What Greyfield did not know was that Esperanza had been secretly learning everything about that furnace for months. She learned how to raise and control its heat, how to keep it burning at full strength, and how to adjust airflow to create exact conditions. She had also slowly stockpiled coal in a nearby storage room, telling overseers that Mr. Greyfield wanted extra fuel for future kitchen expansion. 3 days before the meeting, Esperanza received news that removed any remaining doubt. Carme had been sold. James Rutherford wanted more field hands and convinced Greyfield to sell him for 60 sterling. The deal would be completed right after the council meeting, and Carme would be sent to the Rutherford plantation the next morning. When Esperanza learned this, she knew her time was almost gone. In 3 days, she would lose the man she loved, be forced into breeding, and watch the Rice Council continue destroying her people. Waiting was no longer possible. That night she met Carme beside the fallen cypress tree for what they both knew would be the last time. They whispered for hours, squeezing 15 years of shared memories into a short, painful goodbye. Carme begged her one last time to leave with him. There was still time to reach Spanish Florida and build a life away from plantations and chains, but Esperanza would not change her mind. She told him these men believed they were gods, that they believed they could do anything without consequence. Tomorrow, she would prove them wrong. She would show them that they were human, and that humans fight back when pushed too far. Carme knew arguing was useless. He had known her for less than 2 years, but he recognized the iron in her voice when her decision was final. Instead, he spent their last hours helping her polish the final details of the plan. The next morning, June 22nd, Esperanza began her final preparations. She carefully inventoried kitchen and storage rooms, noting every tool, ingredient, and object that might help. She paid close attention to the iron chains and shackles kept in the pantry, tools used to restrain slaves during punishment. She also studied the kitchen layout and the movement of other domestic slaves. Her plan depended on keeping innocent people away and making everything appear normal until the final moment. Above all, she prepared the coal furnace. Starting at dawn, she fed it coal at exact intervals, slowly raising the heat while making it look like ordinary cooking work. By late morning, the furnace was near its peak temperature and ready to stay there for hours. No one noticed anything unusual. Esperanza had always worked quietly and carefully, and her actions looked the same as they always had on meeting days. She cleaned the dining room, arranged chairs, prepared dishes, and set out the crystal glasses Greyfield loved to display. But behind the kitchen walls, preparations were underway that would turn a routine business meeting into something far darker. By noon on June 23, 1716, the first members of the Rice Council began arriving at Greyfield Estate. As usual, Marcus Sutton came early, riding up the oak-lined road toward the main house with the confidence of a man who believed nothing could ever touch him. Here is the revised version with slightly changed wording. Same meaning, similar length, simple English, no headings, and full punctuation. The volume is maintained and not reduced. He was a man who owned more than 800 human beings and believed he answered to no authority on earth. Esperanza stood at the kitchen window and watched as Sutton climbed down from his horse and passed the reins to a slave from the stables. At 53 years of age, Sutton was among the older men on the Rice Council, and his body clearly showed the impact of many years of excess and comfort. He was large and thick-set, with thinning grey hair and a flushed face that belonged to a man who drank far too much imported rum. Even so, his eyes were still sharp and cold. They were the eyes of someone who had built wealth by treating people as objects, meant only to be bought, sold, and used as efficiently as possible. Sutton's plantation focused on what owners politely called seasoning, a cruel system meant to crush the spirits of newly arrived African slaves and force them to accept slavery as permanent and unavoidable. Slaves who resisted this process were often sent to Sutton, who had developed increasingly inventive ways to break their will. His methods were so effective that other plantation owners regularly sent their most defiant slaves to him, paying high prices for his services. Edmund Greyfield welcomed Sutton at the front door with exaggerated politeness, the kind plantation owners reserved for one another, while showing none of it to the people they enslaved. The two men withdrew to Greyfield's private study to talk about business matters too sensitive for the rest of the group. These discussions focused on new ways to control slaves and plans to pressure the colonial government into loosening limits on slave imports. During the next hour, The remaining 12 members of the Rice Council arrived in small groups. Their horses and carriages crowded the circular driveway in front of the main house. Esperanza recognized every man as he arrived. She had served at enough of these meetings to know their faces, their voices, and their special skills in managing human property. William Petton arrived with his usual group of armed overseers, a habit he had adopted after barely stopping a recent slave uprising on his plantation. James Rutherford came alone, but his saddle carried polished silver pistols that marked him as both a plantation owner and a colonial judge. Henry Caldwell arrived in an ornate carriage decorated with his family crest, a showy display meant to highlight his social goals and political connections. Each man was welcomed with the same formal courtesy and the same shallow talk about the weather, crop yields, and the ongoing trouble with native tribes along the frontier. These men believed they were builders of a great civilization, pioneers turning wilderness into productive farmland that would supply the growing cities of colonial America. What they refused to admit was that their world rested on organized cruelty. Their wealth came from the unpaid labor of thousands who were treated worse than animals, and their political power existed mainly to protect and expand this brutal system. At exactly 2 o'clock, Edmund Grayfield officially opened the monthly meeting in his formal dining room. The 14 men took their usual places around a massive oak table imported from England at a cost that could have supported an average colonial family for years. The table gleamed under the light of dozens of candles set in silver holders, creating an atmosphere of wealth and refinement that strengthened their belief in their own importance. Esperanza began serving the meal with her usual quiet efficiency, moving smoothly as the men spoke about slavery with the same casual cruelty that had marked their previous 180 meetings. She had heard these conversations countless times before, but today she listened more closely than ever. Every word, every tone, and every careless mention of suffering mattered. The meeting began as it always did, with talk of rice prices in Charleston and plans to increase profits during the next harvest. William Petton proudly announced that his plantation had reached record productio by using what he called incentive-based management. This system rewarded slaves who exceeded daily quotas with slightly better food, while those who failed were punished regularly. The secret, Petton explained as he sliced into imported beef, was making them understand that comfort depended completely on productivity. Give them enough hope to keep working, but never enough safety to make them feel secure. James Rutherford agreed. He said separating families worked extremely well as motivation. Nothing, he claimed, pushed a man harder than knowing his wife and children were held elsewhere, and that seeing them again depended on steady performance. For nearly an hour, the men continued in this manner. Each shared ideas on how to extract the most labor while spending as little as possible on food, shelter, and medical care. They discussed breeding slaves with the same cold interest ranchers used when improving cattle. They exchanged punishment methods, like craftsmen trading professional tips. Esperanza refilled wine glasses and removed empty plates while the men praised their newest achievements in cruelty. Her face remained calm and obedient, but inside she was carefully noting each man's habits, weaknesses, and likely reactions when the moment came. As the official discussion ended and the mood relaxed, the men began telling stories that exposed the full depth of their brutality. Marcus Sutton described a new torture device from the Caribbean, a small metal cage hung in direct sunlight, designed to slowly cook rebellious slaves to death over several days. Samuel Kingsley bragged about a breeding experiment that involved forcing selected slaves together in hopes of creating a new generation of larger and stronger field workers. It was George Baxter, the youngest member of the council, who finally pushed events toward what was coming. "Gentlemen," Baxter said as Esperanza poured brandy after dinner, "I have exciting news about a new opportunity. The Spanish are paying very high prices for experienced slaves in South America. I suggest we combine our resources, buy a large ship, and begin exporting our older, less productive stock." The room exploded with excited talk as the men calculated the profits they could make by selling slaves to Spanish colonies, where conditions were even harsher than those in South Carolina. They debated transport plans, discussed political allies who could secure permits, and estimated how many people they could sell without weakening their plantations. As Esperanza listened to them plan even more destruction, something inside her finally broke. For 15 years, she had survived by believing their cruelty had limits, that even men like these would eventually recognize some line of human decency. But there were no limits, there were no lines. Their ability to cause pain was held back only by money and imagination. It was time to let them feel what powerlessness meant. At exactly 9:47 p.m., according to the germ and clock standing in Greyfield's dining room, Esperanza de Lima acted. The 14 members of the Rice Council had finished their formal business and were relaxing in the casual conversation that usually ended their meetings. The room was warm with candlelight and body heat, heavy with the smell of expensive tobacco and fine brandy. Most of the men had loosened their clothing and settled into comfortable positions, fully confident in their control. They were discussing Samuel Kingsley's idea for a formal breeding registry to track bloodlines across plantations and create what they believed would be a superior class of slaves bred for strength, intelligence, and obedience. The discussion had turned technical and academic, as if they were talking about soil quality or crop rotation. None of them noticed when Esperanza quietly left the dining room, claiming she needed more brandy from the kitchen. None saw her carefully locking every exit except the kitchen door. None realized she had been slowly raising the temperature of the coal furnace all evening, pushing it to a dangerously high level. Her plan was simple and horrifying. Over the past several days, she had used her access to storage rooms to place iron chains and shackles throughout the house. These tools, usually used to punish slaves, were now positioned so she could restrain anyone quickly. She had also prepared a special mixture taught to her by her grandmother, made from local herbs that could knock a person unconscious out within minutes if taken in food or drink. This mixture had been added carefully to the brandy she had served all evening. As the members of the Rice Council continued talking about breeding humans, the first effects of Esperanza's preparations began to appear. George Baxter, who had drunk more brandy than anyone else at the table, began to feel lightheaded and confused. At first, he blamed the heavy heat and the alcohol, but only moments later his body sagged in the chair and he struggled to stay awake. Soon after, the same strange weakness spread to the others. William Peaton suddenly complained that his stomach was turning. James Rutherford rubbed his eyes, unable to keep them focused. Marcus Sutton noticed his hands shaking without control. Edmund Greyfield was the first to sense real danger. "Gentlemen," he said, his words already thick and uneven, "I believe something is wrong. I think we may have been—" His sentence never ended. His legs failed him, and he collapsed onto the expensive Persian carpet, the one that had cost more than many colonists earned in an entire year. Within 20 minutes, all 14 members of the Rice Council lay unconscious on the floor. Esperanza moved with calm, careful purpose. She used rope and cold iron shackles to bind each man's wrists and ankles. These were the same tools that had been used for years to restrain enslaved people, made to cause pain, prevent escape, and still keep the body alive. She made sure every knot and clasp were tight enough to hurt badly, but not tight enough to stop blood flow. She did not want mercy through quick death. As she worked, she spoke softly to the men, switching between Portuguese, Spanish, and broken English. Sometimes she explained what she was doing. Other times she recalled acts of cruelty she had seen with her own eyes. At moments, she simply released the anger that had been growing inside her for 15 long years. "You sell my people like animals," she whispered to James Rutherford as she locked the iron around his ankles. "You trade lives like they mean nothing. Tonight, you will know what nothing feels like." To Marcus Sutton, she said quietly, "You break minds. You teach people to forget they are human. Tonight, you will feel what a broken spirit truly is." When she leaned over Edmund Greyfield, her voice carried years of buried hate. "You think you own me. You believe you can do anything you want. You think I am an animal. Tonight you will see what animals do when they are pushed to the end." After all 14 men were fully restrained, Esperanza began the hardest part of her plan. One by one, she dragged their heavy bodies from the dining room, through the silent house, and into the kitchen. Each man weighed far more than she did, and she had to stop often, moving slowly to avoid noise that could wake overseers or other enslaved workers. The task took nearly 3 hours. By 2 in the morning, all 14 council members were placed in a wide circle around the massive coal furnace, their feet pointed inward, hands bound behind their backs with iron. Their mouths were packed with raw cotton so they could not cry out when they woke. The furnace burned at its highest heat, filling the kitchen with a crushing warmth that made breathing difficult even for someone standing freely. Esperanza had planned every detail. Heat, thirst, and forced stillness would slowly drain their strength and leave them time to think about what was happening. Still, she had prepared something faster as well. As the first pale light of morning crept through the kitchen windows, the men began to wake. The herbs she had used caused long unconsciousness but no lasting damage, so they would understand everything clearly. Edmund Greyfield opened his eyes first. His confusion turned to pure fear as he realized he was trapped on the stone floor of his own kitchen, bound tight, unable to speak, surrounded by his fellow council members in the same condition. The furnace at the center of the circle glowed like a small version of hell. As the others woke, the room filled with muffled screams and desperate movements against restraints that would not give. For the first time in their lives, they felt the total helplessness they had forced on countless others. Esperanza sat quietly in the corner, sharpening the kitchen carving knives with slow, steady strokes. She positioned herself so every man could see her face. She met their eyes one by one as understanding settled in. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said in clear, confident English, better than she had ever spoken in front of them before. "I hope you slept well. We have many things to talk about, and I want your full attention." She rose and walked slowly around the circle, looking down at them with the same cold judgment they once used when inspecting people at the market. "For 15 years I served your meetings. I listened to your words. I heard you talk about my people as cattle, to be bought, sold, bred, and destroyed whenever it suited you." She stopped near Marcus Sutton, who twisted wildly against his chains. "You, Mr. Sutton, are skilled at breaking spirits. You take people who still remember their humanity and force them to forget. You know how to kill hope and turn strong men and women into empty shells." She moved to James Rutherford. "You, Mr. Rutherford, use family separation as a weapon. You tear parents from children and husbands from wives because you know lonely people are easier to control." She continued around the circle, calling each man by name and describing acts of cruelty she had seen or heard during their meetings. With every word, their struggles grew more frantic, their muffled cries more desperate. At last, she stood before Edmund Greyfield. "And you, Mr. Greyfield, are the worst. You had choices, you had education, wealth, and power. You could have acted with decency. Instead, you chose profit over humanity." She returned to the center, standing before the roaring furnace. "Today, you will know what it is to be powerless. You will learn what it means to depend on someone who sees you as less than human. And you will die slowly, with plenty of time to remember the pain you caused." What followed over the next 6 hours became whispered legend across Colonial South Carolina, though the full truth stayed locked away in sealed records for generations. Esperanza de Lima turned the Greyfield kitchen into a place of judgment, where 14 powerful men learned, too late, what helplessness truly meant. She began with the mind, walking around the circle and calmly describing scenes of suffering from her years of service. She spoke of children torn from mothers, families ripped apart, and proud people crushed through repeated abuse. Her tone was calm and businesslike, just like theirs had always been. "Mr. Peaton," she said, kneeling beside him, "do you remember a woman named Asher? She was pregnant when you bought her in 1714. You worked her until labor began, then sold her baby before she could even recover. She cried for 3 days. You ordered her whipped because her crying disturbed your sleep." Peaton's eyes widened as memory struck him. He had committed so many cruel acts that most blurred together, but Esperanza remembered every one. She moved to Charles Warwick. "You enjoy watching punishment. You attend whippings like entertainment. Last spring you paid Mr. Greyfield to let you deliver 50 lashes to a man who tried to escape. You took your time so he would stay awake. You smiled while you did it. The heat from the furnace grew unbearable. Sweat soaked their fine clothes, mixing with tears. Some men showed signs of collapse, breathing fast, faces red, eyes dull. Still, Esperanza continued. She retrieved a leather-bound ledger from Greyfield's study, the book where human lives were reduced to numbers. She opened it and read aloud in a flat voice. April 12, 1715. Sold boy named Caesar, age 14, for breeding. £45 sterling. Note, mother became difficult after separation. Recommends sale or disposal. June 3, 1715. Female named Rebecca died in childbirth. Child survived. Estimated loss 20 pounds. Note, improve feeding to reduce losses. Page after page she read cold records of suffering. Lives destroyed, families erased, dreams crushed and written down as buzzin'. Notes. Each entry was a human story turned into profit, and the weight of those words filled the burning room. Psychological punishment went on for nearly 2 hours, with Esperanza forcing each man to face the full weight of his crimes against humanity. She had an exceptional memory for details, sharpened by 15 years of quietly listening to their words and observing their behavior. She remembered exact dates, specific names, and precise acts of cruelty that each man had carried out or commanded. She could repeat their own words back to them without hesitation. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the heat inside the kitchen rose close to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, she calmly moved into the next stage of what she had planned. From a storage space near the back of the kitchen, she brought out several long iron rods. These tools were normally used to stir burning coal and move heavy pots near the furnace. She placed the rods directly into the roaring fire. Within minutes, the iron glowed bright red, hot enough to cause unbearable pain with the slightest touch. She turned to the men and spoke evenly, telling them that they had spent years perfecting ways to cause suffering without killing. They had learned how to break bodies and minds while keeping their victims alive. Today, she said, she would show them that their lessons had not been wasted. She lifted the first rod from the flames. It shone like trapped sunlight and sent waves of heat through the air. When she stepped toward Edmund Grayfield, the heat alone made his skin tighten in fear. She held the rod close to his face, letting him feel the burning air without touching him. She told him this was for every slave he had marked like livestock, for every human life he had claimed as property. What followed was too savage to describe clearly. The screams that filled the Grayfield kitchen carried far across the land and reached slaves working almost a quarter-mile away. They had never heard sounds like that before. These were not the cries of the beaten, but the broken screams of powerful men discovering true helplessness for the first time. Esperanza moved with care and purpose, pressing the heated iron against each man, one after another. She chose areas that would not kill them but would cause extreme pain. She knew exactly where to strike. She had learned by watching them, by understanding how much pain a body could endure while still remaining awake and aware. Between each use of the iron, she continued attacking their minds. She spoke about what would happen to their plantations after they were gone, and wondered aloud whether their families would continue their cruelty or finally change. She spoke of their children, questioning whether the next generation would follow the same path or discover some trace of kindness. Turning to Marcus Sutton, as he twisted in agony, she spoke of his 16-year-old son William. She said there might still be time for the boy to become better than his father. Maybe learning what happened here would teach him that owning people was dangerous. Maybe fear would succeed where morality never had. The damage to their minds was just as deep as the damage to their bodies. These men had built their lives on the belief that they were superior, chosen to rule and control others. Esperanza stripped that belief away piece by piece. She forced them to feel like objects, controlled entirely by another person's will. As the afternoon wore on and the furnace heat pushed the kitchen temperature past 130 degrees, some of the men showed signs of heat sickness. Their skin flushed and dried, their breathing became shallow, and their struggles weakened. Esperanza had expected this. She would not allow them to escape through unconsciousness. Using methods passed down by her grandmother, she pressed wet cloths to their foreheads and poured small amounts of water into their mouths. She kept them awake while their bodies slowly failed in the overheated room. She told them they had to stay conscious. She reminded them that death was mercy, and mercy had not been earned. The suffering continued through the hottest hours of the day. She kept the furnace burning at full strength while applying the iron again and again. She focused on hands, feet, and faces, places that would cause lasting pain and visible scars if they survived. Yet the most powerful part of the ordeal was not the burns or the heat. It was the complete reversal of power. For the first time in their lives, these 14 men experienced what their slaves lived with every day: They felt what it meant to have another human control their bodies, comfort and survival. They were learning what it meant to be owned. As evening came and shadows stretched across the kitchen floor, Esperanza prepared for the final part of her revenge. The coal furnace had been burning at full force for nearly 18 hours, creating heat that no human could endure for long. One by one, she dragged the weakened men closer to the furnace, placing them so the heat would slowly cook them, while keeping them alive long enough to understand what was happening. She repeated Marcus Sutton's own words back to him as she positioned his body just 3 feet from the glowing coals. She reminded him of Thomas, the young man who tried to escape the previous summer. Sutton had locked him in a metal cage under the sun and left him there for 3 days. Thomas had begged for water, shade and death. Sutton had ignored every plea so others could watch and learn fear. Now the lesson had returned to its teacher. One by one she arranged all 14 men around the furnace. The heat would end their lives slowly, giving them time to reflect on the pain they had caused. She wanted them to understand clearly that this was not random. They were dying because of their choices, their actions, and the lives they had destroyed. As the sun set on June 24, 1716, the Greyfield kitchen held 14 dying men. Finale. While learning what it meant to be powerless in the hands of someone who saw them as less than human. The screaming had ended hours earlier. What remained were weak sounds from damaged throats and labored breathing. The air filled with the smell of burning flesh and coal. Esperanza sat quietly in the corner, sharpening kitchen knives with steady hands. She hummed a soft Portuguese lullaby her mother had once sung in a village destroyed by raiders 20 years before. She did not look at the men, but she listened carefully to their breathing, making sure none slipped into unconsciousness too soon. As midnight neared, the last members of the Rice Council finally gave in to heat, thirst, and burns. Edmund Greyfield lasted the longest, his body hardened by years of comfort and care denied to his slaves. His final words were a weak attempt to bargain. He whispered offers of money and freedom. Esperanza looked at him with the same cold interest he once showed when buying people in the market. She told him she wanted him to die knowing he was wrong. He was not superior, not chosen, not a master by nature. He was simply a man who chose evil and was now paying for it. Those were the last words he heard. When dawn came on June 25, 1716, it revealed a scene that would haunt everyone who saw it. 14 burned bodies lay in a perfect circle around the massive furnace. They were barely recognizable, reduced to blackened remains after 18 hours of heat. Esperanza de Lima sat calmly at the kitchen table, sharpening knives and humming a song no one recognized. She showed no signs of fear or exhaustion. When white overseers arrived, they found a reality that shattered their beliefs. 14 powerful men had been killed by one enslaved woman who had overpowered them and punished them in ways they could barely imagine. The meaning was terrifying. If one slave could do this alone, what might happen if many worked together? Fear spread quickly through the colony. For the first time, the enslavers began to fear the people they had enslaved. Word of the massacre traveled fast, carried by riders sent in every direction, punctuation to inform the victims' families and business partners. However, the colonial authorities soon faced a serious problem when deciding how to react to what had happened. On one side, they felt a strong need to show that any slave rebellion would be answered with fast and extremely harsh punishment. The entire plantation system depended on slaves believing that resistance was useless and that white control was total, unbreakable, and everlasting. At the same time, the authorities also needed to stop detailed information about Esperanza's actions and success from spreading. If other slaves discovered that 14 plantation owners could be killed by one woman using only intelligence, patience, and strong will, the consequences could be disastrous for the whole colonial economy. Governor Robert Johnson called an emergency meeting of the Colonial Council to address the crisis. After 3 days filled with intense arguments and fear-driven discussions, the council reached a decision that placed political stability above public justice. The official documents related to the Greyfield massacre were sealed by direct order of the governor and locked away in the Charleston archives, with clear instructions that they were not to be opened for 50 years. The families of the dead men were told that their relatives had lost their lives in a tragic fire that broke out in the Greyfield estate kitchen during a business gathering. Esperanza's involvement was completely erased from the story they were given. Esperanza herself created an even more difficult situation for the authorities. Executing her in public would require explaining her crimes, and that explanation would spread exactly the kind of story the government was desperate to hide. Letting her live, however, would suggest that slave rebellion could succeed without punishment. The solution they chose was both cruel and politically convenient. Esperanza was sentenced to be sold to a Spanish trader known for supplying slaves to the silver mines of South America, a destination widely understood to be a slow and almost certain death. Conditions in the Spanish mines were so brutal that most slaves survived less than 2 years before dying from exhaustion, illness, or deadly accidents. Even this punishment carried danger. If Esperanza survived long enough to tell her story to other slaves, she could become a powerful symbol of successful resistance and inspire more uprisings. To remove this risk, the colonial authorities made sure she would never arrive at the mines alive. On July 15, 1716, exactly 3 weeks after the Greyfield massacre, Esperanza de Lima was placed aboard a Spanish trading ship called the Santa Isabella, which was sailing for Cartagena. The ship's captain had secretly been ordered to ensure that she did not survive the journey while making her death appear to be an accident. The Santa Isabella left Charleston harbor at evening tide, carrying Esperanza along with 43 other enslaved people. According to the ship's official log, Esperanza died of fever on the 3rd day of the voyage and was buried at sea, following normal maritime custom. Yet rumors quickly began to circulate. Some of the surviving slaves from the Greyfield estate claimed that Esperanza had spoken of backup plans and allies in Spanish-controlled lands who could help her escape if she survived the ocean crossing. Others whispered that she had been seen talking with free black sailors in Charleston harbor, possibly arranging help during the journey. Most troubling of all, several slaves said that Esperanza had spent her final weeks at Greyfield teaching other houseworkers about herbs, about the human body, about their master's weaknesses, and about the fragile points in the plantation system. Justice burns slower than coal, she had told them, but it burns completely. The fire I started will move to other kitchens, other plantations, and other masters who believe they are untouchable. Whether these stories were true could never be fully proven. The colonial authorities acted quickly to scatter the remaining slaves from Greyfield, selling them to different plantations across the region to prevent them from sharing stories or working together. Still, the damage to the colonial mindset had already been done. In the months after the Greyfield massacre, unrest spread through slave communities across South Carolina. There were no more mass killings like Esperanza's careful elimination of the Rice Council members, but plantation owners began reporting an unusual number of smaller incidents that suggested organized resistance. Kitchen fires destroyed plantation houses under suspicious conditions. Valuable animals died after eating feed that may have been poisoned. White overseers suffered strange accidents at the exact moments they were most exposed. Tools and weapons disappeared from storage areas and later reappeared in places that strongly suggested slave involvement. Most alarming to the authorities was the fact that slaves seemed to possess detailed knowledge of their owners' daily habits, business dealings, and family connections far beyond what their assigned duties should have allowed them to know. It appeared as though an information network had formed across the plantation system, allowing knowledge to pass freely between properties that had once been isolated from one another. The psychological effect on the white colonial population was deep and long-lasting. Plantation owners who once walked their land with easy confidence now traveled with armed guards and avoided regular routines. Monthly Rice Council meetings, once central to coordination among owners, were suspended without a clear return date, as no one wanted to gather in groups that could become targets for revenge. Some plantation owners quietly changed how they treated their slaves, not out of moral growth, but out of fear. If slaves were capable of the kind of careful planning Esperanza had shown, then offering slightly better treatment seemed like a reasonable investment in personal safety. Others reacted in the opposite way, tightening control and increasing punishments to frighten slaves into obedience. These plantations soon saw higher numbers of escape attempts, work slowdowns, and unexplained accidents, suggesting that fear-based control was failing. In response, the colonial government passed new laws limiting slave movement, banning gatherings of more than 3 slaves without white supervision and enforcing severe punishment for any slave caught with weapons or tools that could be used as weapons. These laws were difficult to enforce across widely spread plantations and may have encouraged even more careful and hidden forms of resistance by pushing slave organization underground. Perhaps most important, the story of Esperanza de Lima began to travel through networks of free black communities, early underground escape routes, and sympathetic white abolitionists who were starting to oppose slavery openly. Her name became a symbol of resistance and inspired other acts of defiance throughout the colonies. Later historians would argue over whether the Grayfield Massacre was a single act of personal revenge or the beginning of a wider, more organized resistance movement that helped weaken the plantation system. Because the official records were sealed, clear conclusions were impossible, but the evidence suggested that Esperanza's actions encouraged similar resistance across the South. In 1739, 23 years after the Grayfield Massacre, the Stono Rebellion broke out in South Carolina, becoming the largest slave uprising in colonial American history. While direct links to Esperanza could not be proven, some leaders of the rebellion had worked on plantations connected to the original Rice Council. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but it proved that the fear sparked by Grayfield had not disappeared. Slaves across the region had learned that their masters were not untouchable, that careful planning could overcome superior force, and that resistance could succeed even against overwhelming odds. As years passed and the American Revolution reshaped the colonies, the story of Esperanza de Lima became part of oral tradition within slave communities. Parents told their children about the woman who made 14 masters answer for their crimes. Young slaves learned that resistance was possible, that intelligence and patience could outweigh brute strength, and that justice, though slow, would come. The sealed documents in Charleston remained locked away for exactly 50 years, just as Governor Johnson ordered. When they were finally opened in 1766, the colonies were already facing political turmoil that would soon lead to independence from Britain. The Grayfield Massacre was overshadowed by larger events, but it helped reveal a growing truth that slavery carried the seeds of its own destruction. By the time the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, the plantation system that had seemed unshakable in 1716 was already showing deep internal cracks that would one day tear the nation apart. The knowledge that slaves could organize, plan, and carry out complex acts of resistance permanently changed the balance of power. Masters were no longer fully confident in their authority. Slaves were no longer convinced of their complete helplessness. In that shift of belief and fear lay the early beginning of the end of American slavery. In the years after the Grayfield Massacre, quiet hints of the truth began to surface from unexpected places. A Spanish ship's clerk, writing in his private journal during a voyage to Cartagena in late 1716, recorded a remarkable conversation with a Portuguese-speaking woman who had been secretly transferred from the Santa Isabella during a supply stop in Havana. According to the clerk's account, this woman spoke with calm confidence and knowledge that suggested her story was far from finished. She showed striking intelligence about the plantation system in South Carolina, explaining with clear detail the weak points and hidden dangers faced by individual plantation owners across the colony. She said she had arranged what she called the first lesson, while also warning that it would not be the last. The fire that started in one kitchen, she reportedly told the clerk, would soon move from kitchen to kitchen. The lessons I learned while watching masters carry out their cruel work are now being passed on to new learners. Whether this woman was truly Esperanza de Lima was never fully proven, yet colonial records from Spanish Florida began to note the arrival of unusually knowledgeable escaped slaves who held deep understanding of plantation operations throughout British lands. These refugees appeared to be connected to an intelligence system that reached far beyond what any single runaway should have known. Even more alarming to colonial officials, reports began coming in from Spanish territories describing settlements of former slaves who were actively helping escape efforts and resistance actions inside the British colonies. Letters seized by colonial authorities included careful instructions on how to find friendly contacts, avoid patrol paths, and take advantage of the emotional weaknesses of plantation owners who had grown careless in their sense of control. By 1720, only 4 years after the Greyfield Massacre, the colonial government was forced to admit that slave resistance had moved past lone escape attempts and into something closer to organized conflict. Plantation owners across South Carolina began reporting connected events that pointed to careful planning and shared information. Fires in kitchens destroyed several plantation houses in ways that could not be explained as accidents. Valuable animals died after eating feed that seemed to have been intentionally poisoned. White overseers suffered deadly accidents at moments when they were alone and least protected. Most disturbing of all, enslaved people began showing knowledge of their masters' daily habits, business dealings, and family secrets, far beyond what their assigned work should have allowed them to know. It felt as if a hidden network had formed across the plantation system, allowing information to move freely between estates that had once been completely separate. The mental shift among the ruling class was deep and permanent. Plantation owners who once walked their lands with relaxed pride now moved with armed guards and avoided fixed routines. The monthly meetings that had once helped the Rice Council stay united were permanently cancelled. Since no one wanted to become an easy target for planned revenge, some masters began to slightly improve how they treated slaves, not because of moral change, but out of fear for their own safety. If enslaved people were capable of the careful planning and execution that had destroyed the Rice Council, then offering somewhat better conditions seemed like a practical way to stay alive. Other plantation owners reacted in the opposite way, increasing violence and enforcing harsher rules in desperate efforts to scare their slaves into total obedience. These plantations saw more strange accidents, slower work, and rising escape attempts, suggesting their cruelty was backfiring. The colonial government responded with new laws that limited slave movement, banned gatherings, and demanded severe punishment for any enslaved person found with possible weapons. These rules were hard to enforce across widely spread plantations and may have pushed resistance into more secret and advanced forms. As the years passed, the story of Esperanza de Lima became deeply rooted in the culture of slave resistance throughout the American colonies. Parents quietly told their children about the woman who made 14 masters answer for their cruelty. Young slaves learned that their masters were not untouchable, that careful planning could defeat stronger forces, and that justice, though slow, could still arrive. The sealed records locked away in Charleston's archives stayed hidden as Governor Johnson ordered. But the truth had already spread through other paths. Every slave community knew the core facts. One woman, armed only with knowledge and determination, had killed 14 of the most powerful men in the colony and escaped their punishment. Whether Esperanza truly lived on to continue her work in Spanish Florida, or whether later reports were legends meant to inspire hope among desperate people, became less important than the effect her story had. Masters were no longer sure of their total control. Slaves were no longer convinced of their complete helplessness. In that change of mindset lay the beginnings of everything that followed: the growing resistance efforts, the secret escape networks, and the repeated rebellions that would eventually help bring down the entire plantation system. The kitchen at the Greyfield estate remained unused for 66 years after that night of judgment, slowly falling apart as later owners found no one willing to work there. Local enslaved people refused to enter the room where Esperanza had shown what happens to masters who push human beings beyond their limits. In time, the building was torn down and the land allowed to return to wild growth. Still, the lesson survived, handed down through generations of enslaved families who understood that those who choose to treat other people as property do so at great risk. Property can think, property can plan, property can remember everything. And sometimes, when pushed beyond human limits, property fights back. Justice burns more slowly than coal, but it burns completely. What do you think about this story? Do you believe everything has already been revealed, or are there still secrets hidden deep within the archives of our nation's dark past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into America's hidden history and want more stories that uncover the truth behind official records, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who values the power of untold stories. History is often written by the winners, but sometimes the voices of the oppressed find a way to speak across the centuries. See you in the next video, as we continue uncovering the dark secrets that shaped our nation